Chapter 2. Nancy Kerrigan opened her eyes as the train slowed for a stop, and watched the stockyards flee past the windows, like the spots on the refilled desk of cards. It was good to be home, despite the trouble she brought with her. The straw-haired man was on his feet, and when he glanced back along the car, she noticed the rock marks on his cheeks and a teeny white scar above one eyebrow. He was very tall, and the way in which he flipped the gun belt around his hips spoke of long practice. She had never seen this man before, but she had lived too long in the West not to know his kind. Since the Lincoln Country War and the land grant fights, there had been many of this kind in New Mexico, and now there were rumors of trouble building in the Tonto Basin of Arizona. Yet this man was not going to the basin. He was leaving the train at Alamitos. She became aware that he was looking past her with sudden sharp attention. His eyes flickered over the car again, returning to the seats behind her, and involuntarily she turned to look. The man who had been seated back there was gone. The train had made no stops, and this was the only passenger car. Yet the man was gone. Obviously disturbed by something he did not understand. The big gunman's eyes rested briefly on her, and for an instant he seemed about to speak. The train slowed and steam drifted past the windows. She picked up her bag and walked down the aisle. Conscious of being stared at, she glanced at the stocky man in a broadcloth suit and derby hat, his florid face and glassy blue eyes directed at her with singularly disagreeable attention. She averted her eyes, yet she had a feeling his interest was not entirely due to the fact that she was a woman. When she descended to the platform, FLINT was waiting for her near the corner of the freight depot. Nancy Kerrigan was a girl who found her home attractive. She had gone to school in the East, but for her, the world revolved around Alamitos, the high plains of her own ranch, her cattle, the man who worked for her, and particularly the wild, free country. She had lived at Khyber most of her life except for her time at school and a few visits to friends, and for her it had always seemed the ultimate in security. Now that security was menaced in a way she had never believed would be possible, and with it, her whole future was at stake. FLINT took the bag from her hand and started toward the backboard. FLINT had come west with her father and uncle, and had helped to found the Khyber. Since her father's death he had been foreman, no businessman. He was nevertheless an excellent cattleman, understanding range conditions and the fattening of cattle as few men did. She drew his attention to the straw-haired gunman. FLINT put her bag in the backboard and then said quietly, "Whoever is paying the bills is going first class. That's Baghdad." The name was legend. Baghdad, shortened by common usage to Baghdad, was known where the range riders gathered. A professional fighting man, at times a bounty hunter, rarely a town tamer. He was always a hunter and killer of men. Nancy Kerrigan was familiar with cow country gossip. Often enough, the fighting in cattle or sheep wars was done by hands on the job, without importing gunmen, and many a rancher was prepared to handle his own shooting chores. But when men like Buckner came to town, somebody was preparing for war. As FLINT helped Nancy into the buckboard, she saw him glance across the street, and two Khyber men sauntered from the walk in front of the store and got into their saddles. They were Pete Gaddis and Johnny Otero. "Army escort?" FLINT nodded grimly. 2 weeks has done a lot to this country. Has there been trouble? Nugent lost 50 head of streets. He trailed them south along the mill path, and then they just seemed to drop off the world. Rustlers? Nancy was incredulous. When your father and I came into this country, we didn't have a neighbor within 100 miles in any direction, living out Indians, but this country is changing fast. Yes, there are rustlers working now, for the first time. Nancy waved at Geddes and Otero. Johnny Otero had grown up on the Khyber where his father had been one of their first hands. He was New Mexican, his family coming up from Mexico more than 100 years before. On his mother's side, the family had been living around Santa Fe since before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. Now 19, Johnny was considered the best rifle shot in the country. Pete Geddes had been at the ranch only 4 years, the newest of their hands with one exception, and he had a reputation for being a tough man in any kind of a fight. Geddes had been a shotgun guard on the Cheyenne to Deadwood stage, deputy marshal in a tall cowtown, and a warrior in more than one range war. A short, solidly built man, he was a top hand. Flint struck a match with his left hand and copied it in his left palm to this sugar. Boris, and two strangers filled a homestead on piece of Nugent's range, claiming it was government land and open for filing. He said, "You know Tom Nugent? He flew off the handle and burned them out, and there was a shooting. The homestead shot out and shot a Nugent rider out of the saddle. One of the strangers died right there, and the last I heard, Nugent and his crowd were hunting the other one of east of the year. What happened to Boris? He lit out for Alamitos like his tail was afire, and they let him go." Nancy Kerrigan started to explain the situation to Flynn, then decided to wait until she had thought it out and decided upon a course. Flynn was good at handling men and cattle, but had little imagination and was hesitant to offer advice. The business side of the ranch she had been handling even before her father died. Besides, the decision must be her own, as Khyber was her own. "Do you think," she asked suddenly, "that Port Baldwin had anything to do with those quarters?" Flynn was astonished. He flicked the ash from his cigar against the whipstock. "I never gave it any thought," he said honestly. "You take after the colonel, Nancy, you surely do. That sounds like the colonel himself." Alone in her room, Nancy took the pins from her hat and removed it, fluffing her hair a little and thinking about the results of her trip to Santa Fe. Outside, on a far green slope cattle fed, and just over the low hill the streams all flowed toward the Pacific Ocean, while here, where the ranch was situated, they flowed toward the Atlantic. The low hill out there was the Continental Divide, although it could not be guessed from a casual glance. Supposedly her trip to Santa Fe had been like all the others, to shop for new clothes or things for the ranch. She had shopped, but her major purpose had been to consult her father's lawyer. To Nancy, the Khyber was one of the few permanent things in a changing world until she overheard a casual comment in the store in Alamitos one day while getting her mail. A couple of drummers waiting to see the proprietor had been discussing land titles and their general insecurity. The idea nagged at her consciousness until she went to her father's desk and the big iron safe and got out the ranch papers. There were bills, receipts, records of cattle bought or sold, payroll records, a list of expenditures and planned development, but there was no deed. Everything had been kept with meticulous care, and had there been a deed, it would have been among those papers. When her father and uncle had come west, title deeds had no importance. They stopped where there was water and grass, and they owned land by right of possession. The right was never questioned in the early days, except by roving Indians. Colonel Carrigan had talked business with the Indians, and had bought land from them. Several times since then he had, when the years were bad and the Indians hungry, given them a few head of steers. For a long time there had been nobody else within miles. The ranch had grown larger. The few deals made had been by driving cattle east, selling to the army or to survey parties. It had taken the trip to Santa Fe to show Nancy how flimsy was this rock upon which she was building her life. Her father and uncle had settled on the land 18 years before, when she was scarcely 3, and she had come to live on Khyber when she was 5. Twice before she left for school, she had survived Indian attacks on the ranch, both by roving bands of Pawnees. They had a claim, the judge assured her, by right of possession, and such claims were usually allowed, but settlers were streaming. Western Congress was looking favorably on the claims of settlers wanting land. That her father had bought land from the Indians might not help at all, for another Indian could always be found to dispute the right of the original Indians to sell land at all. Out on the knoll, west of the ranch house and not quite to the continental divide, were buried her father, her aunt and uncle, and 3 cowhands who had died in fights to save the ranch from Indians. Buried in a neat row along the further sands of the little cemetery were 9 Pawnees and 3 white mountain Apaches who had died trying to massacre the ranchers. Nancy got out the carefully drawn map her father had prepared at the ranch where their cattle grazed. The ranch lay south of the railroad and roughly from the divide to the lava beds, called the Millpills, and south to the Datil Mountains. What was called the home ranch, however, comprised 55 sections of land. With the exception of few wildly scattered meadows used to grow hay against the winter, none of it could be considered farmland. For a long time she studied the map. It was a good map, for her father had been an army engineer in the war with Mexico and had good training in the field. Every waterhole was carefully marked, as well as seeps and such places where water might be found in the wet years. Upon those waterholes the ranch depended. Without them the ranches could not exist, nor could anyone else. Cattle would walk miles for water, but there was a pond beyond, which it would not pay for they walked of good beef. That was why several of the waterholes on the range had been developed by themselves, maintained by themselves to keep the stock from wandering farther than necessary. From earliest childhood she had been taught to accept responsibility and to make her own decisions and abide by them. "Every youngster wants to be grown up," her father said. "But the difference between a child and an adult is not years, rather it's a willingness to accept responsibility, to be responsible for one's own actions." It was a lesson she learned well, and in the years since the death of her father, the ranch under her management had earned money and improved in value. It was she who had conceived the idea of digging for water and thus creating new waterholes. Nancy went to the door. Flynn was standing near the corral, talking to Pete Gaddis. "Ed, will you come here a minute? And don't go away, Pete. I want to talk to you too." When Flynn was seated, she had Joanna, the Mexican girl, bring coffee. Then she explained why she had gone to Santa Fe. He sat very still, not talking at her, but tracing imaginary patterns on the table with his finger. "Ed," she said finally, "we shall have to move fast. I have a bad feeling about all this. I want you to file on Iron Springs. I'd like Pete Gaddis to file on the Blue Hole, and Johnny Otero on Rock House. The ranch will provide everything needed, and when the land has been proved up, we will buy it from you." "How will we manage it? If we all start a run on Santa Fe, somebody will start asking questions." "You will go by yourself. I want you to ride the horse spring it, and take the stage from there. Come back the same way. I would like it if nobody knew you were gone." He glanced up quickly. If Flynn did not know whether Nancy Kerrigan knew about Gladys Soper or not. Nancy was, it often thought, a very uncertain girl sometimes. Maybe she knew that he had been keeping Gladys, and maybe she did not. Of one thing he was sure. Nancy Kerrigan would never admit it if she did. Nobody meant Gladys too, and that could make a difficulty. "It will have to be you, Ed," Nancy was saying. "They know you, and they will file for you without creating any toll, and that is the way I want it." Gladys had plans for the next few days. This trip would raise hope. With those plans, and Gladys could be difficult when she wished. Damn it, if there was only some way. "And Ed, let's double the saddle stock. We are keeping up. We will be doing a lot of riding from now on." It was the coming of the railroad that changed everything, Nancy thought. True, they had made a lot of money supplying beef to the workers where the road was being built, but when the railroad went in, the riffraff came. That man on the train with the florid face and the pale blue eyes now. Who was he? Why was he there? And why had he tried to attract her attention? Had he known who she was? Had he guessed why she was in Santa Fe?